What's up everyone, my name is MarkHawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with Sony's new HDR-AS50 released in 2016 and we're putting it up against the compact Sony AZ1 released in 2014. Now we're going to take these cameras across snowy environments, urban environments, sunny mountainside environments, across all sorts of times of day. Anything you have a question about, you can use any of these quick links above to jump to the section you're most interested in or use as a bookmark reference for later. Anything we discuss in this video, you can check out the more information section below this video, including raw video clips and images you can download for yourself. And if you're using those links, or even if you don't make it to the end of this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. It helps this channel out tremendously. And we'll also have a bunch of referral links that you can use below this video to jump to the products or check out things we mentioned throughout this video that you can use to accompany your action camera awesomeness. Now, if a lot of what you're hearing sounds familiar, we do film with several cameras at the same time, so we end up reusing a lot of footage and some of the same dialogue to describe things. Like here, we're going to start off by checking out these cameras, what they do best at 30 frames per second. Now, 30 frames per second is a good baseline, but it's not the only frame rate or resolution we're going to be looking at in this video. This is just a really good way to check out your footage and sort of see a baseline of what everything looks like on fair ground. Now, the AZ1 and the AS50 are virtually identical in a lot of ways. They both share a very similar color profile. They have very similar sharpness and quality settings, and this will become very apparent when we zoom into this plate up to 100%. Now, when it comes to sharpness and clarity, both of these cameras are going to be on par with one another. I will say on my end, without the YouTube compression, the HDR-AS50 on the left-hand side of your screen just slightly beats out the AZ1 in terms of sharpness and quality, but we are talking about very marginal difference. One of the areas you actually might be able to see a difference is sort of the color saturation in the AS50 on the left side of your screen. You'll notice as compared to the right side, it's a little less muted. Our blacks have a little bit more poppiness in that grass in the lower right of each of your screens. But as we zoom into 200% here, and we'll do this a little bit throughout the video just to emphasize certain issues, just to sort of showcase it a little bit better through YouTube compression, you'll notice they're very similar plates, just you can sort of see that green pop on the left side of the screen. You can basically see all the colors pop on the left side of the screen just a little bit better. Now, like I said, we're going to be going through a bunch of different terrains here, and one of these is snowy environments. They're really hard to film in because we're filming with a giant reflector on the ground. So we have this giant bright surface, and we have these really harsh contrasting shadows. Now, up until recently, helmet cameras had a really hard time of dealing with these different exposures, but as you can see on the ground, we actually can see a lot of detail in the snow, and we can also see a lot of detail in the trees in the distance. Again, both of these images aren't super sharp. They're a little bit muddy in areas, but we're not losing anything. We're not really losing a lot that we're going to be upset about. Again, we'll zoom into 200% here. There's not really a big difference in focal distance on these two cameras either. Again, they're very much on par with one another. Now, even though we are zoomed into 200%, you can see that we are losing a lot of detail in things like tree branches. But when we have these environments, these nice urban environments with a lot of harsh lines and basically not a lot of overlapping colors that are very similar, our picture quality is still very nice and definitely acceptable. It's not anything that's sort of on the cheap or lower end. It does feel like a nice image, but if you are looking for something sharper, you're going to want to aim towards the AS200 or X1000V level of the Sony action cameras. Where some of the bigger differences will come with the AS50 is some of its UI stuff and features, which we'll get into a little bit. The HDR-AZ1 does have its nice little compact body, which makes it much easier to mount to the side of your helmet. It does have some more premium features like external microphone support. But again, in terms of video quality, which is what we're mainly focusing on here, like look at the text on the iPhone. I will say the AS50 does do a better job with sort of up-close focus. The AZ1 is definitely a bit softer. You can see this really in my sort of chin hair and the text on that iPhone there. Everything is just noticeably softer in those little detail areas. Exposure-wise, again, these cameras are very similar. Like I said, filming in snow is incredibly difficult just because we have this giant bright surface. You can see both cameras are actually exposing for this fairly well. We're getting a little more detail again in the AS50, and hopefully this comes through in the side-by-side through YouTube. Now, one of the big areas the AS50 is going to differ from the AZ1 is it has some field of view options that we just don't have in the AZ1, especially when we're in video mode. Both of the cameras do ship with a wide field of view. This is a 170-degree field of view lens. Now, we're going to pop over to a side-by-side and you can basically see these differences here. So you'll notice in the upper right, we have the sort of sun overexposing that area, and that's actually a lot of lost information. Our color profile is just getting crunched a little bit, and even if we were to gamma that zone down a little bit, all of that cloud information that was there to the naked eye is going to be gone. Now we switch over to steady shot here. This was originally the only way we can get a more narrow field of view, but one of the issues with filming in steady shot when you're not really moving is the plate has a tendency to sort of drift in one direction or not. The AS50 we can actually enable narrow field of view, which actually locks the plate down without trying to do steady shot. Now if you look on the right side of your screen, especially at the start of when we went to 100%, check out the bike pedal. You'll notice it'll sometimes sort of sway up and down, almost like we're sort of very slowly underwater, maybe like a slow motion. Having narrow field of view just locks that camera down to that more narrow field of view, which is slightly more zoomed in feel. Now, along with having narrow field of view, the AS50 has a variable zoom, which you can use to, which you can actually zoom in with your remote, your smartphone, or the camera itself. And what we're basically doing is we're doing a digital zoom. So basically, this is the same effect we'd have with the AZ1 if we just sort of zoomed up 200%, 300%, 350%. The benefit with the AS50 is if you want to quickly cut something out, or if you set the camera off far away and you want to zoom in and you don't want to adjust it in post, this is a really nice option to have. But since we are doing a digital zoom, you're going to notice we're scaling up past the point we have information. So our image is actually going to get a little bit sort of distorted and extremely grainy because we have basically a rasterized image and we're just sort of scaling up information we don't have. So the camera is sort of artificially just sort of creating information in that zone. It's not like an optical zoom with a lens. Now when we have these giant blue skies, or we have colors of a very similar nature that kind of slowly ramp off into a lighter version or a darker version of themselves, so sort of like blue to lighter blue, action cameras basically have a tendency to crunch down some of those colors, whether it be compression or color profiles, determining how those colors sort of pop. You want to watch these areas for a lot of things that are going to look like compression blocks. This happens a lot just with like blue skies or foliage that has a lot of motion blur in it, or if you're moving the camera, you'll start to notice the skies just sort of get a little bit blocky. Luckily in this video here, in this example, you're not going to see it, but it is something that pops up from time to time, but it's not super bad on the AZ1 or the AS50 in a lot of our examples, and we did film a lot. We just didn't notice any sort of weird things happening. Now here we're doing a lens distortion test. We're basically moving the camera around. Both of these cameras have a very extreme lens distortion. You'll notice this especially on the AZ1. Basically, if you think of the center of your screen as a circle, the bigger that circle gets, the more extreme the lens distortion gets on both of these cameras. And you notice the edges of the screen will basically stretch in, become really nice looking, and then as they get to the other side of the screen, they'll start to stretch and get pulled off the screen. The AS50's lens distortion isn't as severe as the AZ1, but it's a very marginal fix. Now both of these cameras do ship with steady shot. It's basically one of the best selling points of these two cameras. Steady shot is basically going to reduce 40 to 50% of your sort of handheld jitters and make a lot of unusable shots, basically salvage them into something really cool. Now what we've gone and done is we just showed you them sort of on off, but here we have both of them synced up, and steady shot turned off with 60 frames per second. It's really smooth. Notice how we had that lens distortion looking at that before. When we have things in the center of the screen and we're just sort of moving around, it's not really as noticeable as when we're trying to point it out. So if you were really hung up on some of the lens distortion stuff, take this steady shot off as sort of an example of what things would look like in the background. Now when we have steady shot turned on, again we get a more narrow field of view, so we're a little more zoomed in, but you'll notice we don't have as much sort of micro shakings. We're not going to remove a lot of those big bumps, like when we go over this bump, but like this is one of the major selling points of this camera. Now I will say it's really hard to tell, but with the AS50 it does feel slightly better, but I gotta imagine that's just some sort of slight software side tweaks. It's nothing probably on the hardware end. And you'll notice here we've frozen the plate just to sort of see if steady shot is doing anything weird. You'll notice that most of the text on my helmet, basically they're on par with one another. Maybe the blacks are a little more crisp on the left side of your screen, but again, very marginal differences. But look at that exposure in the snow. We're able to see all the snowboarding lines and stuff like that. It looks really good. Now if you watched the AS50 versus the AS200V video we did yesterday, this section is going to be a little bit shorter because the AZ1 is greatly hampered in filming underwater with the basic condition that it really can't film underwater and get usable results. Unfortunately, the AZ1 does ship with a bubble housing, which is really good at protecting the camera from water damage. However, there's no flat lens option, so on the left side of your screen, the HDR-AS50 does ship with a flat lens, and it's a really nice low profile flat lens, so it doesn't really have so much surface area, so things like mud or water splashing on it when it's on the side of your helmet or in a selfie pole is greatly reduced. So with the AZ1, they never came out with a flat lens, so anything that films underwater, the light gets refracted in a weird way, and it just always looks distorted and blurry like this. Now, both of these cameras actually ship with the ability to change your scene color, and what that is normal is basically anything above water, but we actually have the ability to change the scene to underwater, which basically accounts for the massive amount of blue pixels in the water, and it floods the camera with a little bit of extra red pixels. That way you can basically have a more balanced image underwater. Now, you notice here as we swap back and forth, take a look at the whites on the mask we have underwater, especially on the left side of your screen on the AS50. You're going to notice the whites pop a little bit more, and it's going to seem a lot more balanced in our next example here. But again, the AZ1 just super blurry. I mean, the colors balance out really well. It's just a shame the AZ1 never had a flat lens mount. So with both of the cameras filming in underwater scene mode, our colors underwater, you'll notice, especially after we go right from above water to underwater, you can actually see the pixels go from being really saturated in teal to being very red. So watch here as we go above water to underwater. See how quickly the camera starts to quickly transition those underwater pixels to be redder, and that's because we are filming in scene mode. Now, if we weren't filming in scene mode, you can actually see this in our last video with the AS200V. I'm sorry, not filming in scene mode, it's filming in underwater mode. You'll notice that the pixels have a tendency to stay more teal as opposed to this sort of nice balanced blue. Again, the AS50 just has that dive housing. Things are really nice and actually usable. AZ1, everything's just sort of a murky mess. That case that it's shipped with is really meant to only protect it from damage or water damage. The AZ1 actually is a splash-proof camera, which is really nice. You can't submerge it without the case, but if it does get splashed in an incident like this, it'll be okay. The Sony AS50 is not splash-proof at all. In fact, it has no sort of sealing or housing, so if that camera gets wet, you're in real danger. And also the AS50's dive case is almost impermeable to sounds. The AZ1 actually will have very muffled sound in the waterproof case, so if you wanted to keep it protected, which we'll go over in just a little bit here, you'll actually be able to hear sound from it, but it'll be very muffled. Now, both of these cameras are capable at filming at 120 frames per second at 720p. And you can see here as we break the sort of surface tension, we can actually see the water ripples break apart, especially in the AS50. Now, the AZ1 does have the ability to set up the camera so when it records 120 frames per second, it automatically converts the video to playback at 30 frames per second, which means you get this 4 times slow motionness without having to do the work in post. With the AS50, that's not really a problem. If you plan on editing your footage later, you can film at 120 frames per second, slow it down to 25%, and get this nice 4 times slow motion. And the same could be applied to 60 frames per second. However, I believe with the AZ1, 60 frames per second has to be done manually in slow motion later. Now here we have a really good example of just going from like filming at 120 frames per second, then quickly slowing it down to 30 frames per second. You can really see a big difference on how you go from like 100% to 25% speed. And yeah, again, both of these images, like even at 120 frames per second, very similar. Now, surprisingly, the AZ1 does film at 240 frames per second at 720p. The fastest frame rate we can get out of the AS50 is 120 frames per second. So what you're seeing on screen is 8 times slowed down, which is really nice and smooth at 240 frames per second. But you'll notice at 120 frames per second, that becomes very choppy. So before we were looking at 4 times slowed down, this is 8 times slowed down. And you'll notice that while the quality on the right is a little bit softer, especially in those little specular highlights you can see on the sort of the upper shadowy side of this circle, the quality isn't that bad on both of these cameras, but I mean, you're going to be limited to 4 times slow down on the AS50, which most of the time will get you there. And if you want to go faster and you're not in the water, chances are you have a smartphone that can film at 240 frames per second at a much higher resolution. Now in this next section, we're going to go through some audio tests, so I'm going to calm down here and we'll chime back in just a bit. But yeah, this is our audio test for these two cameras. Now I'm just talking at a normal tone and you're able to hear the voice. In a second here, we're going to cut over to some sort of idle helicopter noise in the background. Now all of these cameras are not in their waterproof case. Anything in the waterproof case is going to sound muffled greatly in comparison. It'll sound fine for the most part, but it's not going to be something you're going to listen to later and be like, oh man, that sounds great. It's always going to be like, oh, I'm surprised how well that sounds in the case, but it is around something you expect. So get asked a lot what this sounds like with the cameras inside the case if the sound is too muffled. So this is what it sounds like when I'm just doing general talking, and that's with sort of noise in the background, just to give you an idea on what the distance is like. Now at the start of this audio test, I mentioned that when things were in a dive case or waterproof housing, you should be able to hear a voice without it being muffled. However, with the AS50 on the left side of your screen, it's completely silent with the dive housing. It's actually crazy how much sound the AS50 is preventing from actually being recorded. This is also probably a good spot to point out that the AZ1 does have an external microphone port, while the AS50 does not. So now we're going to move into filming in low light or during golden hour, which is my favorite time to test these cameras because there's just a lot of nice lighting conditions and some just really great contrasting shadows. So if you're going to be testing these cameras to see how well they're doing on your end, I definitely suggest during that golden hour period when just before the sun sets. Now, if you are testing your cameras, you're going to want to make sure you're filming in XAVC-S mode. This is basically each of these cameras' high bitrate mode, and the big benefit to this is you use a full bitrate of 50 megabits a second for each camera. However, you're going to want to use the right micro SD card. Sony cameras are a little bit picky on what micro SD card they use to unlock the maximum bitrate, or at least they're a little more upfront about telling you that it's not allowing you to go to the maximum bitrate, whichever way you want to look at it. You're going to want to get an XC formatted card, and again, there's a lot of suggestions in the more information section below this video from me and other people on the internet. But yeah, XC formatted cards, you don't want to get an HC formatted card. XC formatted cards are generally from 64 gigabytes or higher, so if you have a 32 gig card, chances are you have an HC formatted card. And you're going to want to make sure your class level is 10, but probably more likely USH 1 or 3. Those are ideal. Again, there's some suggestions in the more information section below this video. Now the color profile on both of these cameras is really ideal to filming in sort of low light conditions. It just handles these sunsets really nice because the color profile by default on the Sony line of action cameras is a much cooler blue. Here as we transition from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen seamlessly, you can really see that sort of color profile difference. The AS50 has a slightly green, warmer tint, while the AZ1 is a little more muted with a hint of magenta in it. But when we cut out these big wide open scenes and we're not looking at them side by side, they're very similar to one another, even in terms of like the information we're retaining and losing in both of these. The area in which the cloud sort of loses the information on the left side of the screen isn't too far off from the AZ1, but you can definitely see the AS50 is sort of crunching its whites a little more because the white bloom out happens a little bit more into the clouds as compared to the AZ1. If you're not doing any work in post color correction, this probably won't bug you because right out of the box you're going to get a really nice poppy colorful image on both of these cameras really. Now, Sony cameras are also known for being really good in low light. Now, we're basically in our nighttime setting modes right here, but since we don't have a camera on the left that doesn't handle nighttime too well, it's very hard to sort of show these differences. Again, both of these color profiles I think look really good during sunset, but they really just excel in low light conditions because any other camera during this time of day gets extremely large grain. Now, our pictures here are grainy and they're not going to be the equivalent of a full size image sensor, but for a CMOS sensor, the backlit image sensor on the AS50 and AZ1 is really good and consistent results for low light footage. Now where we're filming right now is almost completely pitch dark. There's no street lights around us, but again, both of these cameras make a really good job of making it feel like it's really dusk. It just lifts those values quite a bit. Now when you're filming at actual night and there's no sun, it's going to look more like the lower part of your screen, but again, if you have some sort of light in your environment, even if it's low light, these cameras are going to perform very well. Now, both of these cameras do still photography. However, I did not get to do a time-lapse with the AZ1. The AZ1's time-lapse isn't going to be nearly as good as the AS50's time-lapse. Actually, take a look at our AS50 versus AS200 if you want to kind of see an idea of how bad the AZ1's time-lapse ability is going to be. However, my battery died on my phone, wasn't able to switch the camera to time-lapse mode, so I had to proceed without it. Now, you're also going to notice the AZ1 has a bigger image sensor. Actually, no. Both of these cameras actually share the same image sensor, identical. Sorry, I'm confusing it with another one. These images are one-to-one pretty much the same. I couldn't tell you a difference. You can actually download these in the more information section below, along with some actual video raw clips to judge for yourself. But yeah, when it comes to images, these are both nice. The shutter button is on the top of the camera. It takes the picture a few seconds later. I could be really nitpicky on what I don't like about these cameras, but I really like this mountain shot. I think that looks really good. If you're actually going to look at these and download these photos yourself, that's probably my favorite one to take a look at the differences in details. It's obviously going to be much higher clarity than when we're filming in video. And but where the button placement is on these cameras and how these cameras take photos, big thumbs up. There's really, I could be nitpicky, but it's, you know, it's good. Anyway, that's going to wrap up our side-by-side with Sony's HDR-AS50 up against the compact AZ1. Let me know what you thought in the comment section below. Be sure to like and subscribe and check out those links in the more information section below this video for raw image clips or sort of links to the products we talked about, as well as some micro SD card suggestions. Now we will be putting the AS50 up against review of a bunch of other different action cameras. Be sure to follow us and check up on that. You can also watch progress or check out our adventures on Instagram, join the conversation on Twitter, all that social media stuff. But really, I just want you guys to visit MarkHawkCam.com, where you can actually leave your own reviews on the cameras and products we review on top of my review. That way we can sort of have a community average. It's not just my opinion versus no one's. It's basically a community effort. And we have a bunch of fun stuff going on over there, and I'm really trying to build that up. But anyway, I'm Mark Hawk. Let me know what you thought in the comments section below, and I'll see you out there. Have a good one, everyone.